Let me begin by congratulating the ILA for bringing us together at this unique global moment when the need for effective leaders has never been more critical to our well-being as a people. I want also to congratulate each of you for your contributions to both developing a new leadership culture and highlighting the need for a new leadership paradigm that can help bridge the gap in a world that is integrating and fragmenting at the very same time. Almost 50 years ago, when I was organizing the civil rights movement in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, our search for leadership was a search for leaders who called us to a higher purpose, for leaders who inspired us, for leaders who elevated us, and for leaders who appealed to our better nature. At the beginning of the 21st century, just as my colleagues and I launched a binational center on leadership and public values, we saw the emergence of a very different concept of leadership. A high-profile and increasingly influential group of people seemed to be in search of leaders in whose image they saw themselves. Someone who looked like them, someone who acted like them, and thought like them, if they thought at all. This romanticizing of ordinariness appeared to have lost its glow and its steam in 2008, when people around the world cheered the election of Barack Obama at a moment when history and hope seemed to rhyme. But it is clear, not just here in the United States, but in many of your countries as well, that our public life is still plagued by a very dangerous streak of ordinariness that has caused the dumbing down of even the public discourse about leadership. To make matters worse, we are meeting at a moment in which the mood of our time has been described by psychologists as one of free-floating anxiety. There have been periods like this in many of your countries, but here in the United States, the period after 9/11 was such a moment, and the period after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy was such a moment. Yet, today's anxiety is not the result of one event, but a confluence of events. It runs the gamut from anxiety about the almost free fall of an interdependent world economy, to anxiety about what violence conflicts are doing to our soul as a people, from anxiety about whether a new meanness has emerged that seeks to delegitimize those with whom we differ, to anxiety about whether the increasing tendency to use the public square to promote private interests will lead to an eclipse of the very idea of a public good. We are so anxious that we are even anxious about the fact we are anxious. So what are the implications for leadership studies, leadership research, leadership centers, and the many manifestations of our commitment to improving the quality of leadership for the future? When many of our colleagues think of training or preparing leaders to cope with times like these, they tend to emphasize what leaders need to know and what leaders need to do. My focus has been on how leaders need to be. So when my colleagues and I developed the United States Southern Africa Center for Leadership and Public Values at the University of Cape Town and at Duke, We developed a curriculum and chose a pedagogy that focused on leadership as a way of being. We were not the first to think of leadership in this way, but we were early in the development of a program that put flesh and bones on the concept, one that sought to bridge culture, context, and complexities, one that allowed us to use Nelson Mandela as a prototype and to develop a program that sought to cultivate the values that made him one of the most respected and revered leaders of the modern era. Some of you will get a chance to hear more about that program in a panel that follows this session. It was my great privilege, my great fortune, to work closely with Nelson Mandela as he sought to build a non-racial democracy at the southern tip of the African continent, where a system of separate development had been institutionalized into a pigmentocracy. Rights and privileges were apportioned in accordance with color and culture. The idea of separate development was really a form of intentional underdevelopment of a people. But I had a front row seat as Mandela brought different values and a different vision to the quest for national community. Heads of state and royalty from around the world beat a path to his door for advice and counsel on the great issues of the day. And of course, for some, a photo op, so they could say to their constituents that they had once been in the presence of this global icon. The irony, however, is that after 27 years of incarceration, Mandela went from political prisoner to president. He was in prison while the world economy was becoming interdependent. He was in prison while we were developing the internet. He was in prison while we were becoming addicted to the cell phone. He was in prison while we were being seduced by the notion that experience trumps wisdom and judgment. But he came out of prison, took over the leadership of his party and his country, and never missed a beat. Because for him, leadership was a way of being, rather than simply the mastery of a set of specialized functions, management competencies, or public experiences. Mandela's attractiveness and influence came from the power of his personality, the elegance of his humanity, the wisdom of his judgment, the loftiness of his ideals, the calmness of his temperament, and the power of his personal story. He emerged from prison at a time when effective leadership was portrayed by many as the ability to exercise hard power, the ability to bluff, buy, or bully one's way into influence. Even the projection of state power beyond national borders had come to be seen largely as the domain of what Arthur Schlesinger called the warrior caste. Yet, long before Joseph Nye wrote his first book on soft power, Mandela was warning that if we did not solve problems among nations through the use of our brains, we would certainly have to solve them through the use of our blood. One of the primary qualities that enabled him to be more effective than others was his capacity to seduce when coercion was neither desirable nor possible. Much of the respect for him came from his ability to listen, to learn from others, and to show respect for their traditions while maintaining equal respect for his own. He was a skilled negotiator who won many concessions during the development of the new democracy because of his knowledge of the history and culture of his adversaries. Some observers called it a classic case of knowing your enemies well enough to charm them into respecting you. He could draw on lessons from key historical moments to illustrate why his proposals made sense in light of the history of the population groups who had also struggled once against domination. Another quality that stands out in Mandela's leadership style was his ability in the early years to make people feel that with him around, almost anything was possible. Before starting the Leadership Center, I also spoke with other leaders in the United States and in other parts of the world about how best to meet the leadership challenges of the future. Some spoke of a need for a new civil servant who understands that bureaucracies can be both efficient and humane. Others spoke of the importance of political leaders who seek power to disperse it rather than simply dominate it. Some talked about the need for business leaders who understood that ethics is good business, that running a morally sensitive corporation can contribute directly to the bottom line. Others talked about the need for leaders in the civil service and in civil society who understand that they are custodians of values as well as resources. So as I reflected on the leaders with whom I had worked and on my own leadership experience in business, government, and civil society, I concluded that leadership as a way of being has 4 essential elements. Daniel Goleman has emphasized the importance of emotional intelligence, and I agree that leadership is more art than science. I have been a manager and I've been a leader. As a manager, I prized order, but as a leader, I had to be willing to risk chaos. Yet, while my grounding in what Goleman called emotional intelligence has been critical, I found in Mandela and some of the other effective leaders I've known 3 other elements that have caused me not simply to think of leadership as a way of being, but to develop a leadership program based on that concept. Emotional intelligence must be accompanied by moral intelligence. One of the greatest challenges facing leaders today is to apply ethics to our aggregate existence and to know how to think about, how to talk about, and how to apply values to our work without getting caught up in the politics of virtue or the parochialism of dogma. I cannot overemphasize what a grave mistake it would be to allow questions regarding the appropriate role of ethics in our aggregate existence to remain primarily the domain of moralists interested only in the private behavior of individuals. Far too much of our discourse about ethics in public life is about the microethics of our individual existence, the private virtues that build character. My focus in the programs we developed has been on the macroethics of our aggregate existence, the public values that build community. It is not that I'm uninterested in the cultivation of private virtue. It is simply that religion does a great job of proclaiming moral absolutes, while our leaders today must often deal with moral ambiguities. Now, there are many who question whether it is indeed possible to identify moral prescriptions or standards that would bridge the gap between context and culture and be acceptable to all of humanity. In other words, they ask, is it possible to identify a set of common values, a set of precepts so fundamental that they dissolve borders, transcend races, outlast cultural traditions, and transcend the boundaries that the writers of sacred texts and the proponents of secular philosophies have created in order to protect cultural identities? My friend Rush Kidder, who passed away recently, traveled the world in search of an answer to that question. He concluded that it was indeed possible, and he published a book on the subject. Others point to the universality of the so-called Golden Rule. Consider these examples. In Christianity, we say, whatever you want done to you, do also to others. In Islam, there's the saying, no one of you is a believer until he loves for his neighbor what he loves for himself. In Judaism, the saying is, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man. This is the entire law. All the rest is commentary. In Buddhism, there's a saying, hurt not others with that which pains yourself. In Hinduism, there's the saying, this is the sum of duty. Do not unto others what you would not have them do unto you. In Confucianism, it says, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. In Baha'i, and if thine eyes be turned towards justice, choose thou for thy neighbor that which thou choosest for thyself. There's even a Yoruba proverb in Nigeria that says, one going to take a pointed stick to pinch a baby should first try it on himself to see how it hurts. It is clear from these excerpts that it is indeed possible to bridge the moral divide and affirm a set of precepts that transcend contexts, transcend cultures, and transcend complexities. Bridging the gap between context and culture also requires a very special form of social intelligence that appreciates and affirms the dignity of difference. Some of the leaders I have known look at differences and want to homogenize it to fit their comfort zone. Mandela, on the other hand, set out to demonstrate that diversity need not divide, that pluralism, rightly understood and rightly practiced, is a benefit and not a burden, and that the fear of difference is a fear of the future. Howard Thurman, the black mystic, poet, and theologian who was a mentor to Martin Luther King, was fond of saying, I want to be me without making it difficult for you to be you. That's it. Can you imagine how different our world would be if more of us were able to say, I want to be me without making it difficult for you to be you? Can you imagine how different my own nation would be if more Americans were able to say, I want to be an American without making it difficult for an Asian to be an Asian, an African to be an African, or a Latino to be a Latino? Can you imagine how different many of our communities would be if more Christians were able to say, I want to be a Christian without making it difficult for a Muslim to be a Muslim, a Jew to be a Jew, a Buddhist to be a Buddhist, or a Hindu to be a Hindu? I am persuaded that social intelligence helps leaders to become entrepreneurs of identity. Their success hinges on an ability to turn me and you into us. The Mandela era introduced a new form of diversity that was considered essential to an orderly and compassionate democracy. But the principles of pluralism must go beyond democracy and diversity to include demographics and diversity. Public conversations about diversity at many conferences always seem to begin with the grand and almost obligatory assertion that diversity is more than race. And in so doing, the discussion is often about everything else but the richness of racial diversity. So let me be clear. Race still matters. This is not a post-racial society, and how we deal with diversity can be a benefit or a burden. It has been my experience that many very good people make very bad mistakes in assuming that since their own motives are good, they could not possibly be a part of the problem. The truth is, however, that racial inequalities occur and are often produced and reproduced without the intention of doing so, and even without reference to race. Some observers call this laissez-faire racism. Cultivating social intelligence must also emphasize the role of context and culture in shaping leadership styles, strategies, and even paradigms. I learned very early that my experience in social movements, for example, required a very different form of leadership from the authoritarian style that worked so well in the military when I was a 21-year-old college graduate, fresh out of the Army Reserve Officers Training Corps. My first leadership assignment was called a command, and I was called a commanding officer. It was a paradigm of leadership that emphasized the coercive power of the leader who received orders from someone higher in the ranks and passed them on to subordinates. The order was followed because of the threat of court-martial or some other form of punishment. Yet, I learned over time that it was preferable for the soldiers in my unit to follow me because they wanted to, rather than simply because they had to. My second experience of authoritarian leadership some years later was as an officer in a large transnational business corporation. The people in my division did not elect me as their leader. I was recruited and appointed by the chairman, but by virtue of my position, I had the power to reward performance. I learned during my years as a business executive that an organization is what it rewards. It is not so much what it says in its mission statement, its strategic plan, or its code of conduct, as it is what it rewards its people for being. If the company or the university or any one of many of our corporate institutions are serious in that what they say is their primary commitment, then this must be expressed through the performance review process and must be in some way tied to the compensation system. In the 60s, I helped organize and lead the civil rights movement in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. I found the collegial model more appropriate and indeed more effective than the military manufacturing model that has been so romanticized in our history. The collegial model, based not so much on power as persuasion, is now being rediscovered and reaffirmed by the new young leaders who are on the forefront of an intergenerational transfer of leadership. The collegial leader needs consensus in order to act, but I have found that the most effective leader is the one who is able to shape consensus rather than simply wait for consensus to emerge. I have found that whether I work through formal bureaucracies, informal networks of self-managed teams that form, operate, dissolve, and reform. My influence comes from the fact that my primary objective is always to develop, energize, or liberate the leadership potential in others. It is very much like the sculptor who defines his work as simply chipping away the excess stone to allow the statue within to come out. Now, there is no better example of the role of context in shaping leadership styles and strategies than the response to a disaster. I found in my own work as chair of the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation that there are at least 4 elements or stages involved: relief, recovery, reform, and renewal. And each stage requires different leaders or different capabilities in dealing with the widely different circumstances involved. Consider them briefly. The first stage is relief, the time when the disaster is most dramatic, the public attention most pervasive, and the public response most immediate. Survival is at stake, and there is an outpouring of public support to provide relief from suffering and to maintain order. As was demonstrated in New Orleans, an authoritarian leader who can act quickly and often with little consultation is needed to save lives and to deal with other emergencies. But the next stage in the disaster continuum is recovery, taking stock of what has happened, working together to return both private and public life to normalcy, and reinforcing the need for prevention and the mitigation of future disasters. The focus of the first stage is almost exclusively on people, on lives to be saved. The second stage leads to a concern with rebuilding vast infrastructures to mitigate the disaster and to allow people to return to some degree of normalcy. The kind of leadership required is collaborative and collegial, especially the ability to persuade public agencies and private non-governmental organizations that recover requires a different resolve and a use of different resources. The third stage is reform, and it shifts the crisis response paradigm, not just to risk reduction, but to using the crisis as an opportunity to improve the conditions of those who have always been and borne the brunt of disasters, the poor. Support is needed to sustain the public's attention to what needs to be done in the long term, to ensure that the best ideas and the best experts are available to those responsible for recovery, and to ensure that those not normally included in public policy deliberations can have a voice. And then there is another stage, and it is one that is not always obvious. The fourth response to disaster must be that of renewal. Over the years, from my days of organizing in the civil rights movement to my experience of the intensity of the engagement of many leaders in the aftermath of hurricanes, floods, oil spills, earthquakes, and other disasters, I have found that some very good people who are very effective reach burnout. They tend to think of themselves, and they tend to think of personal renewal as selfish, when they really need to stop and to step back in order to serve others better. The inability to step back is best illustrated by the story of a man walking in the woods who comes upon a logger cutting down trees, and as he greets him, he asks, "How are you doing?" The logger replies, "Not so well. I was cutting down 4 more logs this morning, But this afternoon, I cannot cut down nearly as many. The passerby looks at him and says, "Why don't you stop and sharpen the saw?" The logger replies, "I can't do that. I have too many trees to cut." No leadership program should be considered effective unless it emphasizes the importance of the need to occasionally step back and sharpen the saw. And so the final element of leadership as a way of being is what I like to describe as spiritual intelligence. And here I refer to something that transcends the divide often caused by organized religion. Our emphasis on spirituality, on spiritual intelligence, went beyond what is normally thought of as a parochial belief. Most leadership programs are grounded in the intellect. They use the word spirit with regularity, but they rarely deal with the soul of leadership. In this program, we look at leadership as a product of what is happening at the core of the true self, and not just where you locate insight and imagination, but in the ability to find meaning in mystery and to see the sacred in all of nature. A friend of mine described spirituality as a sort of privileged access into one's own soul. That makes a lot of sense, because I have learned much over the years about what the importance of being in touch with the inner self and at ease with my own strengths and weaknesses mean. I have found, for example, that I'm happiest and most at harmony with myself and others when I practice compassion, forgiveness, tolerance, and patience. I have found inspiration also from others with whom I feel a deepened presence. I have not always had to retreat from the noisy sound of either the streets or the workplace, because stillness does not always mean silence. For some, it requires detachment from secondary attraction. Yet it has been my experience that it can also come from a short breakaway moment, from the magical sound of the ocean, the mystical seduction of a song, the singing of a bird, or the rustling of the wind. We emphasize spiritual intelligence and the need for leaders in touch with their spiritual nature for a second reason. The effective leader must be both an agent of reconciliation and the purveyor of hope. And when I mention hope, I have something very different from optimism. Hope theology and hope psychology both argue that optimism adopts the role of the spectator who surveys the evidence in order to infer that things are going to get better. Hope, on the other hand, enacts the stance of the participant who actively struggles against the evidence in order to make things better. For a long time, hope has been considered an emotion and therefore ignored, discounted, or simply dismissed as an essential element of leadership. But psychology is now being joined by other disciplines in seeking to develop a cognitive-based theory of hope in leadership. The basic premise of those scholars and researchers is that hope is comprised not only of emotion, but thinking as well. They are now trying to understand the role of hope in sustaining innovation, the relationship of hope levels to stress, commitment, and performance, even the impact of hope in business organizations on profits, job satisfaction, and retention rates. But the kind of hope we seek to cultivate in the leaders with whom we work was best described by Václav Havel, who wrote, I'm not an optimist because I do not believe that everything ends well. I'm not a pessimist because I do not believe that everything ends badly. But I could not accomplish anything if I did not have hope within me. For the gift of hope is as big a gift as the gift of life itself. The central thesis of any leadership program should be that when leaders provide help, they also provide hope. And the gift of hope is as big a gift as the gift of life itself. So if you remember anything I said this morning, it is this: when you develop or train leaders who can bridge contexts, cultures, and complexities, you provide hope. And the gift of hope is as big a gift as the gift of life itself. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ambassador Joseph has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience, and there's 2 microphones. So if we have a couple of questions, we will be able to do that.
I'm not quite sure why they thought you should be in the dark, but if the lights would come on again. Yes, question here.
Thank you, Ambassador Joseph. I'm quite curious about how you are able to speak on spiritual intelligence without it becoming a religious dialogue and therefore miring down in parochial insights.
Well, I spent some time studying theology. As a matter of fact, I have a graduate degree in theology. And I went through seminary in order to learn the answers to some of the critical questions I was asking about religion. And one of the things I learned is that religion is very much about doctrine and belief. But what I'm talking about is something that cannot be contained by religion. Now, both religion and spiritual intelligence teaches us that we are part of something that is bigger and more mysterious than the self. But when I talk about spiritual intelligence, I'm talking about something that transcends religion. And we are talking today about bridging culture, context, and complexities. And one of those complexities is religion. And so I could talk to you about religion. And when I talk about renewal, it may be that the vehicle for me is religion. But there are many other people out there who found other vehicles. And I want to include them in this discussion of spiritual intelligence as well. Now, for those people who find this in religion, more power to you. But I want to say that you need to recognize that there are other people who find meaning in mystery, who see the world with awe and wonder, but who have difficulties containing who they are and what they believe in a parochial belief system.
Hello. Max, do you have a...
Yes.
I have a...
It's a related question. We think a lot about sitting here about how to open up sacred spaces embedded in civic work. And it seems like something you've thought a lot about. How do you create a sense of sacred in a civic space that is inclusive of people of all religions and no religion? How do you do that?
Well, I started my career as some of you know, as a chaplain at the Claremont Colleges in California. And I found that increasingly, I was also the dean of the chapel, and so I conducted religious service. I found increasingly that when the students who were coming not simply because this was a church that had Christ at the center of its theology and morality, but they were coming because they were engaged in a fundamental quest for meaning. And I say that there are many spaces and places that you can find this kind of meaning. And I mentioned a few, even from the rustling of the wind and the singing of a bird. But I think it is very important that when you try to get people to find this in sacred spaces, even those who are not a part of a religion, that you avoid the parochialness. And most people find it very difficult. Everywhere I go where there is a diverse audience, I hear people who give a very parochial prayer. That's very meaningful to them. But they forget that there are some people out there who may not find meaning in it. And so I started every prayer by saying, "O Holy Spirit, who comes to us in majesty and mystery, to whom we pray in many languages and call by many names." And then I proceed with the prayer. And I find that in doing that, I've embraced everybody. And now if there are those folks who say that, but you didn't mention Christ. I said, but he was included. You know, I mean, that's the kind of approach, and I know that there are a lot of people who are very, very religious who would have trouble with what I'm saying, and that's probably why I never was a parish minister.
I have a question.
Okay.
They can see you. Oh, they can't.
I have a question. You mentioned, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. And you mentioned 4 stages of renewal or
Response to disaster.
Responses to disaster, right? And I just want to make sure I got all this because it was a very deep piece. And you mentioned that there are 4 styles. 4 stages of it, and then each stage needs a different type of leadership. The first being authoritarian, the second being collegial and collegiate or collaborative. And then I missed the other 2, or were you assuming that collaborative and collegial take us through the last all 3?
The reformer leaders, the kind I mentioned when I said I've been a manager and I've been a leader, and there are times when I was willing to risk chaos, and as a manager I needed order. The reform leader must be someone who is a reformer and who recognizes the complexities of trying to be a reformer and who's willing to risk chaos. You can name it. It's certainly not an authoritarian leader. It could be a collegiate leader, but it is someone who's able to get people to work together on the basis of personality, on the basis of passion, and on a number of other bases rather than on the basis of coercion. And then the last one I said was renewal. And I have found that in any setting and under any style of leadership, it is possible to emphasize the importance of renewal, because I even did that when I was a young military officer starting my career. I recognized that it was very important for people to have time for renewal. Desmond Tutu, who sort of epitomizes what I mean by both reconciliation and renewal, every year takes some time off to go and renew himself. I don't suggest that that is necessary for everyone. You develop your own practices, but what is critical is the renewal. And what is critical is having younger leaders who you train, and even younger leaders than that who you develop, have them understand the importance of renewal. Burnout is one of the worst things that can happen to leaders, and it often happens after disaster. I mean, look how many years it's been since Katrina. Some of the young people down there who head nonprofit organizations, have been on the front line almost 24/7 ever since then. As the chair of the board of Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation, one of the first things we did was to develop a fund for renewal, to get the advocates out there a time to step back and to renew themselves. Now, our foundations don't understand that very well. So I have to take that message to my foundation colleagues too, that they need to understand that making grants for renewal is as critical as making grants for program and operation. Yes. You'll tell me when I should stop, but I'm ready to keep going.
Hi, my name is Kiara Wright. I'm serving with City Year Denver. I'm 24 years old. I'd like to thank you first for having us here. We really appreciate it, especially being young leaders. It really means a lot to me, especially to hear your particular message today. I have a question. You stated stillness doesn't always mean silence, and that spoke to me especially. What would you say to someone who wants to be an agent of change, but may have difficulties rallying others to get on board with this change, especially in the matters of education?
Well, in almost any area of change, you have difficulty. Education happens to be one. Well, first of all, you have to convince people that you identify with their struggle. And in my case, in the civil rights movement, I went to Tuscaloosa, Alabama after 4 years in graduate school at Yale. And I went down there and nothing had happened. Montgomery had happened, Birmingham had happened, but Tuscaloosa was the national headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. And so nothing had happened. So I had to go out there and try and persuade people that it was time for them to get involved in seeking change. And that was not easy. But the one thing I brought was an affinity with their struggle. And so in the leadership program we run, it is for leaders primarily from historically black communities or leaders who have been working with the black or other minority communities in the struggle for social change. And it's never easy, but you've got to get out there and you've got to, I would say that if you ask me why was I effective in the organizing civil rights movement, it was the power of my passion. It was the power of my personality. It was the power of my affinity. All of these things help to persuade people that this is a guy who understands our problem. This is a guy we can trust, and this is a guy we are willing to follow. Now, one of the things about trying to organize change is to remember that you are not simply a leader of followers. You are a leader of leaders and potential leaders. And that brings a whole different mentality to trying to promote social change. And so it's who you are as a person as much as what you're fighting for in organizing a movement.
Dr. Joseph, you represent the best of what being an elder in society is. And for the young, yeah, I do too, because I'm an elder too, so you have two elders up here. What advice would you give people on how you keep on keeping on for so many years? You've served our country, our nation, our world for over 50 years. And so what would you say from your heart is how we can sustain ourselves?
Well, I'm driven, and my wife can tell you how driven I am, because she often tells me to slow down. And even though I talk a lot about renewal, it is something hard to practice. Well, you know, I guess what drives me is what has driven me since the first time I stepped out of my comfort zone and sought to change something. And that was when I was a very, very young kid. And I'm driven by a desire to improve the quality of life of people. I'm driven by a commitment to establishing justice. I'm driven by a commitment to promoting the general welfare. And I know that these are the only ways to form a more perfect union. So I'm driven by a form of patriotism, the kind of patriot who's always seeking to form a more perfect union. Now, I wouldn't say that there aren't times when, you kind of get frustrated when you have difficulty raising funds to meet your budget. But I guess what drives me is what I said in that quote from Václav Havel about hope. The gift of help is a gift of hope, and the gift of hope is as big a gift as life itself. And that keeps driving me, just realizing that I have always been a purveyor of hope, and not because I am, for the person who asked that question about religion, I am still an ordained minister. And so I find meaning in my religion, but I find meaning in other religions, in particular those things they share in common. And in a fundamental sense, that is probably what drives me. A sense of a civic imperative, a sense of a moral imperative. And also knowing that when neighbors help neighbors, and even when strangers help strangers, both those who help and those who are helped are transformed. And so I am driven by the knowledge that I'm constantly transforming myself in seeking to reform society. Thank you.
I have to thank you. Hold on. I had the privilege of meeting Ambassador Joseph over a decade ago when I went to South Africa, and he was kind enough to spend some time with me. And since then, I have been following in your wake. On behalf of the International Leadership Association, I would like to thank you for bringing ageless wisdom into our modern times. I want to thank you for serving humanity for over a half a century and for modeling for us the role of elder in society. I would like to thank you for inspiring us to renew our commitment to tap into the gift of hope and the soul of leadership. Let's have a wonderful hand for Ambassador Jim Joseph.